Hey, everybody. So I wanted to just clarify formalism just a little bit. So, what I have for you on the screen is a poem by Emily Dickinson. And as you've learned from your notes, formalism is basically like a deep dive into the meaning of the poem through looking at an analysis of just the words of the poem, ignoring all outside influence. And um, I worry that my one example that I gave you might not be sufficient. So I wanted to give you uh, a slightly better, or hopefully better, interpretation of a formalist approach with another poem. Now, this is not going to be all inclusive. There's much more that you could say about this particular poem, but I'm hoping that you'll get the gist with the little bit that I do here. So, that being said, um, one of the reasons that I gave you that analysis technique, that 3-2-1-2-3 technique, is because that is a form of formalism. Now, formalism takes that technique and those steps one step further and adds a few new words, that terminology that you need to focus on. Things like tension, ambiguity, and unity. So, um, I would personally lump those into step 4 of the 3-2-1-2-3 technique, where you talk about complexity, because you want to focus on tension, you want to focus on unity, ambiguity, and structure. And you would do that in step 4 and 5. So, anyway, without further ado, here we go. So it's called I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. And it goes like this: I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again, then space began to toll. As all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I in silence some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Now, if we were to go through this using your 3-2-1-2-3 technique, then step 1 would be a summary of what is literally happening in the poem. And so if I were to do that, I would mention about how there seems to be this speaker who, even though I don't necessarily know the gender of the speaker, I'm going to refer to the speaker as a she. But the speaker feels a funeral in their brain, and there seems to be some sort of funeral service in their brain. And inside their brain, there seems to be these mourners treading or walking with purpose back and forth. And then they sit down and have the service, and the service keeps beating on this person's brain like a drum, and it's making this person's mind go numb. And then these mourners start to creak across the speaker's soul with the same boots of lead. And then we get a little bit more abstract, where the speaker becomes an ear and hears basically silence and solitude. And then a plank in the speaker's reason broke, and they fell down and down and down, and hit a world and finished knowing then. Hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. So basically, a literal summary doesn't do us much good. So we have to move on to step 2, and that's where we look at literary devices. Now, if you have a situation where a literal summary of the poem doesn't seem to make much sense, then chances are what you're dealing with are some metaphors or symbols. So that's a good place to start with your literary devices in step 2. So I'm going to look at this as if it's symbolic of something. So let's see what we have here. I felt a funeral in my brain. Okay, well, you can't literally have a funeral in your brain, but what you can have are thoughts. And those thoughts can sometimes feel like you're dying, which to me suggests that maybe this person is suffering from some sort of deep depression. And so I'm going to keep that in the back of my mind as I move forward. And I have these mourners. Now, again, you can't have literal people in your brain, but you can have the thought of people in your brain. And if I combine these two lines, then maybe this funeral, this depression that they're feeling, maybe they feel like others have caused this depression, or maybe they feel like they're not living up to the expectations of others, or maybe they feel like they've let others down. Whatever the case may be, these thoughts, maybe these mourners are just thoughts that they're having. Maybe it's not even people. Maybe it's just thoughts that this person is having. And because it's mourners, I can make the assumption that these thoughts must be negative or sad. Well, these thoughts are going around in this person's brain, to and fro, back and forth, treading in their brain, in fact. Treading is to basically walk with a purpose. So they're purposely walking back and forth in this person's brain, these negative thoughts, if you will. And they keep doing that. They kept doing that until it seemed like some sense was breaking through. Now, what kind of sense might be breaking through in that sort of situation? Maybe they're starting to come to grips with their depression. Maybe they're starting to think that they maybe have a handle on their depression, or maybe they think that they know the cause of their depression. I don't know. Let's move on. And when they all were seated, so now these thoughts, these negative thoughts, these mourners, are no longer going to and fro. They're no longer treading to and fro. Now they all were seated. It's like they've taken root in the speaker's brain. And they begin a funeral service. And this funeral service keeps beating, there's repetition here, like a drum. So maybe this service, this chatter, if you will, because that's what happens at a service is people talk and they lament and they, grieve. But it's a lot of chatter, it's a lot of talk. And so maybe these bad thoughts have taken root in this person's brain, and they're getting louder, they're beating like a drum, and it's weighing down on our speaker's brain until they feel like they're going numb. And then these mourners, the speaker says, I heard them, the mourners, lift a box. Well, we've already said that the poem is called I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, and we have a service. So this must be a funeral service. Well, what kind of box would be at a funeral service? Well, that would be a coffin. So the speaker hears the mourners, these negative thoughts, lift a coffin. Why would thoughts lift a coffin? Maybe that suggests that these thoughts are creating this idea of a coffin in the mind of the speaker. So maybe the speaker is starting to feel suicidal. Or maybe these negative thoughts are starting to kill any positive or non-negative thoughts in the speaker's mind. Could go either way there. And look at this. And now these mourners are creaking across the speaker's soul. They've moved from the brain to the soul. So now these aren't just thoughts. These are a part of who the speaker is now. These negative thoughts have become part of the speaker's essence. With those same boots of lead again. In other words, these thoughts haven't changed. They're the same boots that they used to tread through the brain, the same boots that were treading in the brain are now again in the soul. And they're boots of lead. These are heavy, heavy thoughts, heavy negative thoughts. Then space began to toll. So it's like they're creating this. They're weighing down on the speaker. They're creating this. They're taking their toll, if you will. And now we get a little bit more abstract. And as all the heavens were a bell, well, maybe we're dealing with, bells create sound, and the speaker says that they're an ear. So the speaker is hearing all of the heavens. So maybe the speaker turned to religion to try to clear their depression. Maybe the speaker tried to pray their depression away. I don't know. But whatever happened created silence. So I and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. So maybe the praying worked, maybe the religion worked, or maybe it's the exact opposite. Maybe it just made the speaker feel alone. The speaker is an ear at this point. Ears can hear, but they can't speak. So maybe the speaker feels like she can't uh, verbalize what's happening to her, to the outside world. So she sits in silence and solitude. I don't know. But then a plank in reason broke. Reason could be your sense of right and wrong, your sense of knowledge, your sense of logic. A plank in reason. So it's like a floorboard in this person's sanity or their ability to reason. It broke. And she plummeted down and then finished knowing. In other words, maybe she that was the end of her. She was finished. She knew nothing more after that. She was finished knowing. Maybe that indicates that her sanity finally crumbled and now she's gone insane, or maybe the depression has overcome her and now she is ready to end it all. No matter how you look at it, it doesn't look very positive, does it? So we move on to step 3, which is to look at the the speaker's purpose. So it seems to me like this speaker is attempting to relay the effects, the toll that this depression, that these negative thoughts have had on her, but she's unable to. I and silence wrecked solitary here. In other words, maybe the speaker is unable to relay these thoughts and is struggling with trying to relay these thoughts to the outside world. Maybe it's a cry for help. Maybe it's the speaker coming to grips or terms with their reality, their situation. Step 4 is look at the complexity of it. There's a lot of complexity to this. I want to focus on those terms in formalism that I told you to focus on. So we're going to look at the tension, the conflict in here. The speaker has a conflict with herself. She's fighting an internal battle with herself. That's where the tension is, and you see that repeated throughout here. And so if you were to do this where you're pulling quotes to point out the tension, you could talk about the speaker's mind going numb, the mourners treading and treading, service like a drum beating. All of this repetition points to this being an ongoing, continuous battle. This repetition of treading, beating. It's a continuous battle that this person is dealing with. And it drops her down and down. So again, this repetition emphasizes the struggle, this continued struggle that this person is dealing with. So that's part of the tension. But tension also needs to lead to unity. And what happens at the end? The speaker's reason broke, and the speaker dropped down and down, hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. There is a resolution here. There is a sense of either the darkness has overcome the speaker, or the speaker has embraced the darkness. One or the other, but it's over. It's unified. The speaker is unified with the darkness, for better or for worse, because the speaker is finished. Okay? Their plank and reason broke, and they dropped down and down, hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. They are done. They are finished. So then we look at the ambiguity. There were several places that I pointed out to where I said I didn't know, or that you could interpret things a certain way. All of those places where I pointed that out, those are places of ambiguity where different interpretations can be found. So, for example, in this very abstract stanza here, you have the heavens were a bell and being but an ear. I mean, that's kind of ambiguous. So it could be positive, it could be negative. And you would point out those areas of ambiguity and how they help to fold or shape or mold the speaker's purpose. And so if you were to do this and write it all together in a paragraph, what you would then say is you would go through those steps that I talked about, and you would say, at the beginning, it seemed like the poem was about this, and you would go into your summary, and then you would say, but after looking deeper at the literary devices, and you would talk about the literary devices that you looked at, a certain purpose of the speaker could be found, and you would talk about step 3, and then you would go into the complexity, and you would talk about the unity and the tension and the ambiguity and the structure. Let's not forget the structure. So you'll notice several things here. You'll notice that there are these dashes that are at seemingly random points in the poem. You'll also notice that there are words that are capitalized seemingly at random. Now, maybe they're random, maybe they're not. But I think, and this again is just my own interpretation of this using this approach, that the seemingly random dashes and capitalization suggest a fractured mindset. And a fractured mindset really tracks with everything that we've said so far about this being someone struggling with this mental depression. So that fractured mind state is mirrored or demonstrated through the random dashes and capitalizations. I think that kind of tracks. So, also, something else that's kind of neat with the structure here is that there is a rhyme scheme throughout the majority of this poem up until you get to about here. And it's once the speaker's reason broke, once the speaker's mental state collapsed, notice that the rhyme scheme disappears. And the last stanza has no rhyme scheme, kind of mirroring the chaotic state of the speaker's mind. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is the accurate representation of this poem. I'm just saying that it is a interpretation, or I should say an interpretation of this poem using formalism. And then in your paragraph, you would just explain all of those things that we just talked about. So hopefully that helps. Listen to this as many times as you need to get the idea of formalism down, and have a great day.